The autumn wind carried a melody through Xavier Brennan's barn that made him freeze mid-stride, his heart hammering against his ribs like it had forgotten how to beat properly for 32 years, and suddenly remembered. He had been alone on this ranch outside St. Elmo, Colorado, since his parents died of fever 3 years back, and in all that time, not a soul had ventured onto his property without him knowing. Yet there it was, clear as mountain water, a woman's voice whistling an old Irish tune his mother used to hum while kneading bread. Xavier set down the bucket of oats he had been carrying and moved quietly toward the sound, his boots barely making a whisper against the hay-strewn floor. The late afternoon sun streamed through the gaps in the barn walls, painting everything in gold and shadow. There, perched on a bale of hay near his mare's stall, sat a young woman in a dusty traveling dress the color of faded roses. Her auburn hair had come loose from its pins and hung in waves down her back, and she was running her fingers through his horse's mane while whistling that achingly familiar tune. "That is an odd place to rest, miss," Xavier said, keeping his voice gentle despite the questions burning in his chest. The woman startled, her hand flying to her heart as she spun to face him. Her eyes were the exact shade of honey held up to sunlight, wide with surprise and something else he could not quite name. Fear, maybe, or exhaustion, or both tangled together. She could not have been more than 24 or 25, with a face that would have been uncommonly pretty if not for the bruise blooming purple along her left cheekbone and the cut on her lower lip. "I apologize," she said quickly, her voice carrying the soft lilt of someone raised back east, possibly Massachusetts or Connecticut. "I did not mean to trespass. I have been walking for 2 days, and when I saw your barn, I thought I might rest just for an hour before moving on. I should have asked permission first." Xavier noticed then that her dress was torn at the hem, caked with red Colorado dust, and her hands were scratched and dirty. No bag, no horse, no supplies. Just a woman alone in the wilderness, which meant trouble of one kind or another had chased her here. "You are hurt," he said, taking a step closer but stopping when she tensed. "I am not going to harm you. My name is Xavier Brennan. This is my ranch. How did you come to be walking alone out here?" She studied his face for a long moment, those honey eyes searching for something. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her because her shoulders dropped slightly, though she remained ready to bolt. "My name is Sarah Oakley. I was traveling with a wagon train headed to California, but 3 days ago, the man I was betrothed to became violent. He struck me when I refused to marry him before we reached San Francisco as we had agreed. That night, while the camp slept, I ran. I have been walking northwest since then, trying to put distance between us." "Northwest from where?" "We were camped near Poncha Springs when I left." Xavier did quick calculations in his head. Poncha Springs was a good 40 miles southeast of St. Elmo, maybe more depending on the exact location of their camp. For a woman alone on foot with no supplies, it was a miracle she had made it this far. The Colorado wilderness did not forgive mistakes, and October nights already bit with the promise of coming winter. "You cannot keep walking," Xavier said. "Winter comes early in these mountains. Another week and the high passes will be closed with snow. Where exactly were you planning to go?" Sarah's face crumpled slightly before she caught herself, straightening her spine with visible effort. "I had not thought that far ahead. I only knew I could not stay with that wagon train. Thomas, my former betrothed, he told me that once we were married, I would learn my place." The way he looked at me when he said it, I knew that if I went through with the marriage, I would not survive it. Not in any way that mattered. The barn felt very quiet except for the soft sounds of horses shifting in their stalls and the wind whistling through the cracks. Xavier had spent 3 years perfecting the art of solitude, convincing himself that he preferred the company of cattle and horses to people. But looking at this woman, Sarah Oakley, with her brave, frightened eyes and her Irish melody, something in his chest cracked open like spring ice on a frozen river. "Stay," he heard himself say before his mind caught up with his mouth. "Not just for an hour. Stay here, at least until you figure out where you want to go and how to get there safely. I have a spare room in the house. Nothing fancy, but it has a bed and a door that locks from the inside. You can rest and recover your strength." Sarah shook her head immediately. "I cannot impose like that. You do not know me. I could be anyone, anything. You are a woman alone who has been walking for 2 days through wilderness that would kill most men," Xavier said. "You are hurt and tired and have nowhere to go. Those are the only things I need to know right now. Stay, please." The please seemed to surprise them both. Xavier was not accustomed to asking for things, and Sarah was apparently not accustomed to men asking rather than demanding. She worried her cut lip between her teeth, thinking hard. "Just until I can figure out my next move," she said finally. "A few days at most. And I will work for my keep. I can cook and clean and mend. I am actually quite good with horses if your mare there is any judge. She seemed to like me well enough." "Daisy likes everyone who does not pull her mane," Xavier said, feeling his mouth curve into something that might have been a smile if he remembered how those worked. "But if you want to help around the place, I will not say no. Running a ranch alone is more work than 2 hands can manage most days." He led Sarah from the barn to the house, which was a modest structure of timber and stone his father had built 20 years ago. Inside, everything was clean but sparse, the home of a man who had forgotten how to live rather than just exist. The spare room had been his parents' room before they died, and Xavier had not been able to bring himself to use it. He opened the door to reveal a bed with a simple quilt, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, and a window that looked out over the eastern pasture where the last light was painting the grass gold. "There is a pump out back for water," Xavier said, suddenly aware of how inadequate everything must seem to someone who had been planning to reach California. "The privy is behind the house. I will heat water for a bath if you want. You must be wanting to wash off the trail." "That would be wonderful," Sarah said softly, and when she looked at him, there were tears standing in her eyes. "Thank you. You cannot know what your kindness means to me." Xavier did not trust himself to speak, so he just nodded and went to stoke the fire, filling the big copper tub that sat in the kitchen corner. While the water heated, he went to the larder and pulled together a simple supper of beans, cornbread, and the last of a smoked ham. His hands moved through familiar motions while his mind spun in unfamiliar directions. What had he just done? He was a man who spoke to maybe 3 people a month, who went into St. Elmo only when supplies ran desperately low, who had built a life of careful solitude. And now he had invited a stranger to stay in his home, a beautiful woman with sad eyes who whistled his mother's songs. When the water was hot enough, Xavier showed Sarah how to fill the tub, and then retreated to the barn to give her privacy. He sat on the same bale of hay where he had found her, and tried to organize his thoughts into something resembling sense. Daisy pushed her nose against his shoulder, and he scratched behind her ears absently. "What am I doing, girl?" he asked the horse. Daisy had no answers, just warm breath and soft sounds of contentment. The truth was, Xavier had been lonely for longer than he cared to admit. After his parents died, grief had made solitude feel necessary, even protective. He had told himself he preferred being alone, that he had his ranch and his animals and his work, and that was enough. But hearing that melody in his barn, seeing Sarah's face in the slanted sunlight, had reminded him with painful clarity that he was 32 years old, and had not had a real conversation with another human being in months. When he returned to the house an hour later, Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table wearing what he recognized as one of his mother's old dresses. It must have been in the trunk in the bedroom, carefully preserved with lavender and sage. The dress was too big through the shoulders and too short in the hem, but Sarah had tied it with a piece of rope to make it fit better. Her hair was damp and braided, her face scrubbed clean of dirt, though the bruise on her cheek stood out even more vividly against her pale skin. "I hope you do not mind," she said, gesturing to the dress. "My own was beyond repair, and I found this in the chest. It is beautiful fabric." "My mother's," Xavier said. "She would have wanted someone to use it rather than letting it rot in a trunk. It suits you." They ate supper in awkward silence, broken only by the scrape of spoons against bowls. Xavier was out of practice at conversation, and Sarah seemed too exhausted to make much effort. But after they had both cleaned their plates, she looked at him across the table with those honey eyes and said, "Tell me about your ranch. How long have you been here?" So Xavier told her. He told her about his parents, Swedish immigrants who had come to Colorado Territory in 1858 during the gold rush, hoping to strike it rich. When the gold proved elusive, they had homesteaded this land instead, building a life from dirt and determination. He told her about learning to ranch from his father, about his mother's garden and her singing, and the way she could make a house feel like home even when it was just raw timber and hope. They both died in the winter of 1869, Xavier said, the words still catching in his throat after 3 years. Fever took them within a week of each other. I buried them on the hill overlooking the western pasture. Now it is just me and about 200 head of cattle, a dozen horses, and more work than I know what to do with. You must miss them terribly, Sarah said, and the understanding in her voice told him she knew something about loss too. Every day, Xavier admitted. Some days more than others. What about you? How did you end up traveling west with a man you were going to marry? Sarah's hands tightened around her coffee cup. My parents died 2 years ago in Boston, cholera. I had no other family and no prospects. Thomas Whitaker was a business associate of my father's, and he offered marriage as a solution to my circumstances. He seemed kind enough at first, solicitous even. We agreed to travel to California where he had business interests, and we would marry once we arrived and I had time to adjust to my new situation. But somewhere along the trail he changed. Or maybe I just finally saw him clearly. He began making demands, speaking to me as if I were property he had purchased rather than a person. When I pushed back, he showed me exactly what kind of man he really was. "Do you think he will come looking for you?" "I do not know," Sarah said honestly. "Part of me thinks he will be glad to be rid of a woman who would not obey. But another part of me knows that Thomas does not like losing what he considers his. The wagon train was supposed to reach California in late November. If he comes back this way searching, it would not be until spring at the earliest. Then you have time to figure out what comes next," Xavier said. "And in the meantime, you are safe here." That night, Xavier lay in his bed and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of another person in his house. The creak of floorboards in the next room, the soft rustle of someone settling under covers, the gentle rhythm of breathing that was not his own. It should have felt intrusive, but instead it felt like the house was waking up from a long sleep, remembering how to be alive. The next morning, Xavier woke before dawn as he always did and went out to tend the animals. When he came back to the house for breakfast, Sarah was already up and dressed, with coffee brewing and eggs frying in his mother's old iron skillet. The sight stopped him in the doorway, his chest going tight with something he could not name. "I told you I could cook," Sarah said, looking back at him with a small smile. It was the first real smile he had seen from her, and it transformed her entire face, made her beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with features and everything to do with light. "So you did," Xavier managed. They fell into a routine over the next few days that felt both strange and natural. Xavier went about his work, checking fences and moving cattle to fresh grazing, and all the 100 other tasks that kept a ranch running. Sarah cleaned the house from top to bottom, scrubbing away 3 years of bachelor living until everything shone. She mended holes in his shirts, organized his chaotic kitchen, and cooked meals that reminded Xavier what food was supposed to taste like. In the evenings, they sat together at the kitchen table and talked. Xavier learned that Sarah had been a teacher in Boston before her parents died, that she loved literature and had a particular fondness for Shakespeare, that she had always dreamed of seeing the ocean. Sarah learned that Xavier had taught himself to read from his mother's small collection of books, that he had a gift for understanding animals, that he had never been more than 50 miles from the ranch where he was born. "Have you never wanted to see more of the world?" Sarah asked one evening about a week after she arrived. Outside, the first snow of the season was falling, fat white flakes that caught the lamplight like stars. "Sometimes," Xavier admitted, "but this place is in my blood. My parents built something real here, and I am not ready to let that go." "I think that is admirable," Sarah said, "knowing where you belong and having the courage to stay there. I have been running for so long that I am not sure I would recognize home if I saw it." Xavier looked at her across the table, at the way the lamplight caught in her auburn hair and painted shadows beneath her cheekbones. The bruise on her face had faded to yellow and green, and the cut on her lip was nearly healed. In just a week, she had brought more life to this house than it had held in 3 years. The thought of her leaving, continuing her journey to wherever she decided to go, made something in him clench with loss. "What if you have already found it?" he asked quietly. Sarah went very still. "What do you mean, stay?" Xavier said, and this time there was no hesitation, no second-guessing. "Not just for a few days or until you figure out your next move. Stay here. With me. Fill my days forever, Sarah. I know it is fast. I know you barely know me, but I feel more alive in the week you have been here than I have in 3 years. I think about you from the moment I wake until I fall asleep. I find myself hurrying through my work just so I can come back to the house and see your face. You whistle my mother's songs and you make me remember what it is like to not be alone." "Xavier," Sarah breathed, and there were tears on her cheeks now, catching the light. "I feel it too. I have been so afraid to admit it because it is too soon, too fast, too unlikely. But when I am with you, I feel safe for the first time in years. Not just physically safe, but safe in a deeper way. Like I can breathe fully, like I can be myself without fear of judgment or punishment. You are kind and good and steady, and when you look at me, I feel seen in a way I never have before." Xavier stood and moved around the table, kneeling beside her chair so they were at eye level. "Then stay. Be my wife. Help me turn this place into a real home again. I cannot promise you riches or adventure, but I can promise you that I will spend every day trying to make you happy. I will never raise my hand to you or speak to you with anything but respect. I will love you for the rest of my life if you will let me." Sarah cupped his face in her hands, her thumbs tracing his cheekbones with infinite gentleness. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will stay. I will marry you and fill your days and help you build a life here. But Xavier, you have to understand that Thomas might come looking. That by marrying me, you might be inviting trouble to your door." "Let him come," Xavier said. "I am not afraid of trouble if it means keeping you safe." They were married 3 days later in St. Elmo by the circuit preacher who happened to be passing through. The ceremony was simple, attended only by the preacher. the general store owner who served as witness, and the owner of the boarding house who insisted on giving Sarah a bouquet of the last wildflowers before the snow buried everything. Sarah wore another of Xavier's mother's dresses, altered to fit properly, and Xavier wore his Sunday best, which was not very fine but was clean and pressed. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier kissed Sarah with the awkward sweetness of a man who had not kissed anyone in years and was afraid of doing it wrong. But Sarah kissed him back with a warmth that made all his uncertainty disappear, and when they pulled apart, both of them were smiling. They rode back to the ranch together on Daisy, Sarah seated in front of Xavier with his arms around her waist. The snow was falling heavier now, blanketing the world in white silence. Sarah leaned back against Xavier's chest, and he thought he had never felt anything as perfect as the weight of her in his arms, the trust implicit in the way she relaxed against him. That night, in Xavier's bed that was now their bed, they came together with a tenderness that took Xavier's breath away. He had been with women before, hurried encounters in hay lofts and rented rooms that meant nothing and left him feeling emptier than before. But this was different. This was Sarah's hands in his hair and her whispered words of love against his skin. This was taking time to learn each other, to discover what brought pleasure and what brought gasps of surprised delight. This was falling asleep tangled together, completely at peace. Winter closed in around the ranch like a fist, but inside the house, there was warmth and light and laughter. Sarah and Xavier settled into married life with remarkable ease, as if they had been doing this for years rather than weeks. They worked side by side through the short cold days, feeding animals and hauling water and keeping the fires burning. In the evenings, they read aloud to each other from Xavier's small collection of books, or played cards, or simply sat together in comfortable silence. Xavier had never known marriage could be like this. His parents had loved each other, but his father had been of the old country mindset where men and women occupied separate spheres that rarely overlapped. But with Sarah, Xavier found a true partner, someone who challenged him and made him think and met him as an equal. They talked about everything from philosophy to the best way to treat cattle bloat, and Xavier found himself looking forward to these conversations as much as anything else. In December, a blizzard swept down from the high peaks and trapped them inside for 3 days. They spent the time in bed, keeping each other warm in ways that had nothing to do with blankets and everything to do with exploring this new intimacy between them. Sarah was shy at first but grew bolder as she learned that Xavier delighted in her pleasure, that he found her beautiful beyond measure, that he loved her with an intensity that sometimes scared him with its ferocity. "I cannot imagine my life without you now," Xavier whispered one night as they lay wrapped around each other, the wind howling outside like a living thing. "It terrifies me sometimes how much I need you." "I know," Sarah said, pressing a kiss to his throat. "I feel the same." "You saved my life, Xavier, not just from Thomas and the wilderness, but from a future where I would have slowly disappeared until there was nothing left of who I really am. With you, I feel like I can be completely myself. Do you know what a gift that is?" Xavier tightened his arms around her, overcome with love and gratitude and the fierce desire to protect this woman and this life they were building together. "I am the one who was saved," he said. "I was just going through motions before you arrived. Working and sleeping and existing but not really living. You taught me the difference." Christmas came and went in a quiet celebration of roasted chicken and precious sugar cookies, made with Sarah's hoarded supplies. They gave each other simple gifts. Xavier carved Sarah a beautiful hair comb from a piece of birch wood, and Sarah knitted him a warm scarf from wool she had carefully unraveled from an old blanket and respun. They hung sprigs of pine around the house and sang carols together, Sarah's clear voice blending with Xavier's rougher one in a harmony that felt like prayer. January brought brutal cold that froze water troughs solid and made every outdoor task a battle against the elements. Xavier worried constantly about losing cattle to the weather, riding out in temperatures that could kill a man in hours to check on his herd and break ice so they could drink. Sarah worried about Xavier, bundling him in every warm thing they owned and having hot coffee and food ready whenever he staggered back inside half frozen. "You are going to work yourself to death," Sarah said one particularly bad night when Xavier came in with his lips blue and his hands so cold he could not feel his fingers. "The cattle have to be cared for," Xavier said through chattering teeth as Sarah helped him out of his frozen coat and wrapped him in blankets near the fire. "Without them, we have nothing." "We have each other," Sarah said fiercely. "That is not nothing, Xavier. That is everything." "Please be more careful." "I will," Xavier promised, pulling her into his lap and burying his face in her hair. "I am sorry. I have been alone so long that I forgot what it means to have someone who cares if I come home." February brought a brief thaw and with it a visitor. Xavier was in the barn one afternoon repairing tack when he heard the sound of a horse approaching. He went to the door and saw a man he vaguely recognized from St. Elmo, one of the prospectors who drifted in and out of the high country chasing rumors of gold. "Brennan," the man called out. "Name is Charlie Moss. Got news you should hear." "What kind of news?" Xavier asked, suddenly wary. Charlie dismounted and pulled off his hat, revealing a weathered face topped with graying hair. "Word is there is a fellow down in Poncha Springs asking after a woman who ran off from a wagon train last fall. Auburn hair, traveling dress about this tall." He held his hand at about Sarah's height. "Says she is his runaway wife, and he is offering a reward for information about her whereabouts." Xavier's blood went cold. "Did you tell him anything?" "Hell no," Charlie said. "I do not know you well, Brennan, but I know you are a decent sort, and any man who offers money for information about a woman who ran from him, well, that tells me all I need to know about his character. But I figured you should be warned. If he is asking in Poncha Springs, he might work his way up here eventually." "Thank you," Xavier said, his mind already racing. "I appreciate you riding out to tell me." After Charlie left, Xavier went to the house and found Sarah kneading bread dough at the kitchen table. She took one look at his face and went pale. "He is here," she said. "It was not a question. In Poncha Springs, asking about you. Calling you his runaway wife and offering a reward for information." Sarah's hands stilled in the dough, flour dusting her arms up to the elbows. "I am not his wife. We never married. He has no legal claim on me." "I know that. We know that. But men like Thomas do not care much about legal niceties." Xavier crossed to her and took her floury hands in his. "Sarah, I meant what I said when I married you. I will not let him take you, but we need to be prepared. If he comes here, it could get ugly." "I will not let you get hurt because of me," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Maybe I should leave, go somewhere else before he tracks me here." "No." The word came out harder than Xavier intended, but he did not take it back. "You are my wife. Your place is here with me. We will face this together." 2 weeks passed with no sign of Thomas Whitaker, but the waiting gnawed at Xavier's nerves. He found himself constantly watching the horizon, jumping at unfamiliar sounds, keeping his rifle closer than usual. Sarah tried to maintain their normal routine, but Xavier could see the fear in her eyes every time he left the house. The confrontation came on a gray March afternoon when the snow was melting in dirty patches, and the world smelled of mud and cold water. Xavier was working on the corral fence when he saw 2 riders approaching. One was a large man on a bay horse, well-dressed in the manner of successful businessmen from back east. The other was smaller, harder-looking, with the bearing of someone accustomed to violence. Xavier set down his hammer and waited, positioning himself between the riders and the house. Behind him, he heard the door open and close softly. Sarah had seen them too. "Are you Xavier Brennan?" the large man called out as they drew close enough for conversation. "I am." "What is your business here?" "My name is Thomas Whitaker. I am looking for a woman who ran away from my protection last October. I have reason to believe she might have come this way." Auburn hair, about 24 years old, answers to the name Sarah Oakley. "No one by that name here," Xavier said evenly. Thomas's eyes narrowed. "I am not a fool, Mr. Brennan. I have been making inquiries. I know a woman matching Sarah's description was seen in St. Elmo in December, and I know she was in the company of a rancher named Brennan. Now, I am willing to be reasonable about this. Sarah is clearly confused and frightened, not thinking clearly. I am prepared to overlook her temporary lapse in judgment if she returns to me now. There need not be any unpleasantness." "I told you, there is no Sarah Oakley here," Xavier repeated. "But even if there was, I would not hand over a frightened woman to a man she ran from. She told me you hit her, that you tried to force her into marriage." "She is prone to dramatics," Thomas said, his voice hardening. "And regardless of what she may have told you, I have a prior claim. We were engaged to be married. She accepted my proposal freely." "She also freed herself from that engagement when she ran," Xavier said. "She is not your property, Whitaker. She does not have to go anywhere with you." The smaller man, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Mr. Whitaker is being very patient, friend. More patient than I would be. We can do this easy or we can do it hard, but one way or another, the woman is coming with us." Xavier's hand moved toward the rifle leaning against the fence post. "I would think carefully before you make threats on my land." "I am not making threats," the man said. "I am stating facts, Thomas." Everyone turned. Sarah had come out of the house and was standing on the porch, her chin high despite the fear Xavier could see in her eyes. She had one hand behind her back, and Xavier knew without looking that she was holding the old Colt revolver he had taught her to shoot during the long winter. "Sarah, thank God," Thomas said, his voice dripping with false relief. "I have been searching for you for months. You gave me such a scare running off like that, but it is all right now. Come along and we will put this unpleasantness behind us." "I am not going anywhere with you," Sarah said clearly. "I am married, Thomas. Legally married to Xavier Brennan. I am his wife, not your fiancée. You have no claim on me whatsoever." Thomas's face went dark red. "You married this rancher, this nobody cowboy in the middle of nowhere. After everything I offered you, you offered me a prison," Sarah said. "Xavier offered me freedom and love and a real partnership. There is no comparison." "You ungrateful," Thomas started forward, but Xavier stepped into his path, rifle now held loosely in his hands. "That is far enough. My wife told you her decision. I suggest you respect it and leave." For a long moment nobody moved. The tension stretched taut as wire, ready to snap. Then Thomas's companion put a hand on his employer's arm. "Let it go," the man said quietly. "She is legally married. You push this, you will be on the wrong side of the law, and she is not worth the trouble." Xavier could see Thomas struggling with his pride, his face mottled with rage and humiliation. But finally he jerked his horse's head around. "Keep her then," he spat. "She would have been more trouble than she is worth anyway. I hope you enjoy your poverty together." They rode away at a gallop, mud flying up from their horses' hooves. Xavier and Sarah stood frozen until they disappeared from view, and then Sarah's legs gave out. Xavier dropped his rifle and caught her before she fell, gathering her against his chest. "It is over," he murmured into her hair. "He is gone. You are safe." "I was so scared," Sarah whispered. "Not for me, but for you. If he had hurt you because of me, I could not have borne it. I am fine. We are both fine." Xavier pulled back enough to see her face, cupping her cheek in his palm. "You were so brave, coming out here like that, and apparently a very good actress because I believed that you were holding my Colt." Sarah gave a shaky laugh. "I was holding it. I am just not sure I could have used it, but I wanted him to believe I would." "Well, you convinced me," Xavier said. And then he was kissing her, desperate and relieved and so grateful that she was safe and his, and that they had survived this together. That night, they held each other especially close, both of them shaken by how close they had come to losing everything. But as the days passed, and no new threat materialized, they began to relax again, to believe that Thomas Whitaker really had given up and moved on. Spring came to the Colorado mountains in a rush of melt water and green grass. The cattle, lean from the hard winter, began to fatten on the rich new growth. Sarah planted a garden in the same spot Xavier's mother had cultivated, coaxing beans and squash and tomatoes from the rocky soil. The world burst into life, and so did their marriage, deepening and strengthening with each passing day. In May, Sarah began to suspect she was pregnant. She waited another month to be sure before telling Xavier, choosing a soft summer evening when they were sitting outside watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. "I have news," she said, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat belly. "I think we are going to have a baby." Xavier went absolutely still, his eyes wide. "Are you certain as I can be without seeing a doctor? All the signs are there." A smile spread slowly across Xavier's face, so bright and joyful that it made Sarah's heart ache. "A baby," he breathed. "Our baby. Are you happy?" Sarah asked, suddenly nervous. They had never explicitly discussed children, though she had assumed they both wanted them eventually. "Happy?" Xavier pulled her into his lap, cradling her like she was made of glass. "Sarah, I am beyond happy. I am terrified and amazed and so grateful I do not have words for it. You have given me so much already, and now this." "We made this together," Sarah said, kissing him softly. "You and me, a new life because we found each other." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and into fall. Xavier became impossibly protective, insisting that Sarah rest more, refusing to let her lift anything heavy, worrying over her constantly. Sarah bore his fussing with patient amusement, though she put her foot down when he suggested she should not ride horses at all. "I am pregnant, not dying," she told him. "Women have been having babies since the dawn of time, and they did not do it by sitting still for 9 months. I will be careful, but I will not be treated like an invalid." In October, exactly 1 year after Sarah had first appeared in Xavier's barn whistling her Irish tune, their son was born. The labor was long and difficult, attended by the midwife from St. Elmo, and lasting through most of a day and into the evening. Xavier spent the entire time pacing outside the bedroom door, terrified by every cry of pain, certain that something was going wrong. But finally, as the sun set on a crisp autumn evening, he heard a new sound, the angry wail of a newborn. The midwife opened the door moments later, her weathered face creased in a smile. "You have a son, Mr. Brennan, and your wife is tired but doing well. You can come meet him now." Xavier entered the room on shaking legs. Sarah was propped up against pillows, her hair damp with sweat and her face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes were bright with joy. In her arms, wrapped in a blanket Xavier's mother had sewn, was the smallest human Xavier had ever seen. "Come meet our boy," Sarah said softly. Xavier crossed to the bed and looked down at his son for the first time. The baby had a shock of dark hair, a red, wrinkled face and tiny fists that waved angrily at the injustice of being born. He was absolutely perfect. What should we name him? Xavier asked, unable to look away from this miracle they had created. I was thinking Samuel, Sarah said, after my father, Samuel Brennan. Samuel, Xavier repeated, testing the name. Yes, that is exactly right. He reached out with one finger and touched his son's tiny hand. Samuel's fingers immediately closed around Xavier's finger with surprising strength, and something in Xavier's chest cracked wide open. This was his son, his family. A year ago, he had been alone and resigned to staying that way. Now he had a wife he loved beyond measure and a son who depended on him for everything. "Thank you," he whispered to Sarah. "For this, for everything, for whistling in my barn and staying and filling my days with more joy than I knew existed." Sarah reached up and cupped his face, her eyes full of love. "You saved me, Xavier Brennan. You gave me a home and a purpose and a love I never dreamed was possible. This is just the beginning of our story." The years that followed proved her right. Samuel was followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Emma, and then 3 years after that by another son they called James. The ranch prospered under Xavier's careful stewardship and Sarah's practical management. They added onto the house, built a new barn, increased their herd. Xavier proved to be a devoted father, patient and loving with his children in a way his own father had never quite managed. He taught Samuel to ride and rope, showed Emma how to whistle like her mother, carried James on his shoulders while checking fences. Sarah created a warm, loving home full of laughter and learning, teaching all 3 children to read and cipher and think for themselves. They had hard times too, of course. A drought one summer that decimated their hay crop. A winter when sickness swept through the county, and they spent weeks terrified that one of the children would succumb. Arguments and disagreements and all the normal friction of 2 people learning to share a life. But through it all, the love between Xavier and Sarah only deepened. They still talked for hours every evening after the children were asleep, still found ways to make each other laugh, still came together with the passion of newlyweds even after years of marriage. Xavier never took for granted the miracle of Sarah's presence in his life, and Sarah never forgot that this man had given her safety and freedom when she most needed both. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier took Sarah up to the hill where his parents were buried. The view from there was spectacular, looking out over the ranch they had built together, the house where their children slept safely, the land that provided for them all. "I come up here sometimes when I need to think," Xavier said, his arm around Sarah's waist. "I tell my parents about our life, about you and the children. I think they would have loved you." "I wish I could have known them," Sarah said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "They raised a good man." "A lucky man," Xavier corrected. "I think about what my life would be now if you had not appeared in my barn that day. I would still be alone, still just going through motions. You gave me everything, Sarah. Purpose and joy and a reason to build something that will last beyond my lifetime." "We gave each other everything," Sarah said. "That is what love is supposed to do. It is not one person saving another. It is 2 people choosing every day to build something together." They stood there as the sun set, watching shadows stretch long across the land they had made home. In the distance, they could hear the faint sound of Samuel and Emma arguing about something, James's high-pitched laughter, the lowing of cattle settling for the night. "You ever miss it?" Xavier asked. "The life you might have had in California or back east? The excitement and culture and all the things I cannot give you here." Sarah turned to face him, taking both his hands in hers. "Not even once, not for a single moment. This is exactly where I am meant to be, with you, with our children on this land. Everything I could ever want is right here." Xavier kissed her then, sweet and deep, pouring everything he felt into that connection. When they pulled apart, Sarah was smiling, that same smile he had first seen all those years ago in his kitchen. "Take me home, cowboy," she said. "Our children are probably destroying something by now." They walked back down the hill together, hand in hand, toward the house where lamplight glowed warm in the windows. Xavier looked at the life they had built and felt gratitude so profound it was almost overwhelming. He thought about the lonely man he had been, resigned to solitude, going through each day without real purpose or joy. Then he thought about the melody that had changed everything, the woman whistling in his barn, the courage it took to ask her to stay. One moment of bravery had led to all of this. A marriage built on love and respect, children who filled his days with chaos and delight, a partnership that made him better than he could ever be alone. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked as they approached the house. "About how grateful I am that you whistled that particular song," Xavier said. "About how one moment can change the entire direction of a life." "My mother taught me that song when I was small," Sarah said. "I do not even remember choosing to whistle it that day. I was exhausted and scared and trying to comfort myself with something familiar. It is strange to think that something so small could lead to all of this." "Not strange," Xavier said. "Miraculous." They reached the house and went inside to chaos. Samuel and Emma were indeed arguing, this time about whose turn it was to set the table. James had apparently tried to climb the shelves and gotten stuck, requiring rescue. Sarah moved to handle the situation with the calm efficiency of an experienced mother, while Xavier started pulling together supper. This was his life now. Noise and love and constant motion, questions and laughter, and the warm weight of a child who climbed into his lap while he was trying to work. It was so far from the quiet loneliness of his bachelor years that sometimes Xavier could hardly believe they belonged to the same person. That night, after the children were finally asleep and the house was clean and quiet, Xavier and Sarah sat together on the porch. The September air was cool, carrying the first hint of coming autumn, and the stars overhead were brilliant in the clear mountain sky. "Tell me a story," Sarah said, snuggled against Xavier's side. It was a game they had played since their early days together, taking turns weaving tales for each other's entertainment. "Once upon a time," Xavier began, "there was a lonely rancher who thought he was content with his solitude. He worked his land and tended his animals, and told himself that he did not need anything more than what he had. Then one autumn day, he heard the most beautiful sound he had ever encountered, a woman whistling in his barn. That melody changed his entire life, led him to love and family and happiness beyond anything he had imagined, and he spent every day after that grateful for the courage to ask her to stay." "That is a good story," Sarah said softly. "Did they live happily ever after?" "They did," Xavier confirmed. "Not because their life was perfect or without challenges, but because they chose each other every single day. Because they built something real and lasting together. Because love, real love, is not about grand gestures but about showing up and doing the work and finding joy in ordinary moments." Sarah tilted her face up to kiss him. "I love you, Xavier Brennan, today, tomorrow, and every day after that." "I love you too," Xavier said. "You filled my days forever just like I asked. You made my life mean something." They sat there until the night grew cold, comfortable in the silence that exists only between people who know each other deeply and truly. Inside the house, their children slept peacefully. Around them, the ranch stretched out in the darkness, the land they had built their life upon. Above them, the stars wheeled slowly across the sky, marking time the way they had since the world began. Xavier thought about the journey that had brought them here. Sarah's desperate flight from a dangerous situation, his lonely existence on a remote ranch, the chance meeting that became everything. If even one element had been different, they might never have found each other. The idea was terrifying in its randomness, but they had found each other. Against all odds, in the middle of nowhere, two lonely people had created something beautiful and lasting. They had built a family, a home, a love that would endure long after they were gone, passed down through their children and their children's children. As they finally stood to go inside, Xavier took one last look at the land stretched out before them. This was his legacy, their legacy. Not just the physical ranch with its cattle and buildings, but the love they had nurtured, the family they had raised, the partnership they had forged. It had all started with a melody in a barn and a lonely man finding the courage to ask a stranger to stay. From that small seed of possibility had grown everything that mattered. Xavier sent up a silent prayer of thanks to whatever force had guided Sarah to his barn that October day so long ago. Inside, they moved through the familiar routine of banking the fire and checking locks, small domestic rituals that had become sacred through repetition. In their bedroom, they undressed in comfortable silence, climbed into the bed they had shared for 10 years, and found each other in the darkness. "Happy anniversary," Sarah whispered against Xavier's chest. "Happy anniversary," Xavier echoed. "Here is to filling many more days together." "Forever," Sarah promised. "Forever," Xavier agreed. They fell asleep wrapped around each other. Two people who had saved each other in all the ways that mattered, content in the life they had built and excited for all the days still to come. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of autumn and change, but inside the house on the ranch outside St. Elmo, Colorado, everything was exactly as it should be. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of joy and challenge. Samuel grew into a thoughtful young man who inherited his father's gift with animals and his mother's love of learning. Emma proved to have a head for numbers and helped manage the ranch's finances by the time she was 15. James was the wild one, always getting into mischief, but charming enough that he could usually talk his way out of trouble. Xavier and Sarah aged together gracefully, their love deepening rather than fading with time. Xavier's hair went gray at the temples, and Sarah developed laugh lines around her eyes from decades of smiling. They added a few more pounds to their frames, moved a bit slower in the mornings, but the essential core of who they were to each other never changed. When Samuel turned 21, he married a schoolteacher from Leadville named Charlotte, bringing her home to the ranch where Xavier helped him build a small house on the western pasture. Emma eventually married a surveyor and moved to Denver, though she visited often with her growing family. James proved to have a gift for horse training and turned that into a thriving business that supplemented the ranch income. Xavier and Sarah became grandparents, then great-grandparents, watching their legacy spread through the Colorado territory and beyond. They sat on their porch in the evenings, holding hands and watching their grandchildren play in the same yard where their children had played, marveling at how time moved both slowly and quickly. On their 40th wedding anniversary, the family gathered for a celebration. The house overflowed with children and grandchildren, the noise and chaos that comes from a large, loving family. Sarah had cooked for days with the help of her daughters-in-law and granddaughters, and the table groaned under the weight of food. After dinner, when everyone had eaten their fill, Samuel stood up and raised his glass. "I want to propose a toast to my parents," he said. "Two people who built something remarkable here, not just a successful ranch, though they certainly did that, but a real home filled with love and security. They taught us what it means to be committed to each other and to family. They showed us that love is not just feeling but action, showing up every day and doing the work. We are all here because of their courage and their love. To Xavier and Sarah Brennan. To Xavier and Sarah. Everyone echoed, raising their glasses. Xavier felt tears prick his eyes, overwhelmed by emotion. He looked at Sarah and saw his own feelings reflected in her face. This was what they had built together. Not just children and grandchildren, but a legacy of love that would continue long after they were gone. That night, after everyone had finally departed or bedded down for the night, Xavier and Sarah sat alone in their room. Sarah was brushing out her long hair, now mostly silver but still thick, and Xavier was watching her with the same appreciation he had felt on their wedding night 40 years ago. "What are you looking at?" Sarah asked, catching his eye in the mirror. "My wife," Xavier said. "The most beautiful woman I have ever seen." "Flatterer," Sarah said, but she was smiling. "I am old and gray, Xavier." "You are perfect," Xavier corrected. "You always have been." Sarah set down her brush and came to sit beside him on the bed. She took his weathered, work-worn hand in hers, tracing the familiar lines and calluses. "You know what I think about sometimes?" she asked. "I think about the girl I was when I ran into your barn, so scared and lost with no idea where I was going or what I would do. If someone had told me then that I would spend the next 40 years here, that I would build such a beautiful life, I never would have believed them." "I think about the man I was," Xavier said. "So lonely and convinced I had to be. If someone had told me that a woman would appear in my barn and change everything, I would have thought they were insane. But here we are." "Here we are," Sarah echoed. "Still together, still in love, still grateful for that October day." They lay down together, fitting into each other's arms with the ease of 4 decades of practice. Outside, the wind whispered through the grass. Inside, 2 people who had found each other against all odds drifted off to sleep, content in the knowledge that they had lived well and loved completely. Years later, when they were both well into their 70s, Xavier woke one morning to find Sarah breathing shallowly beside him. He called for Samuel immediately, sending one of the grandchildren racing to fetch the doctor from St. Elmo. But Xavier knew, with the deep certainty that comes from knowing someone completely, that Sarah's time was running out. The doctor confirmed his fears. Sarah's heart was failing, worn out from decades of work and life. There was nothing to be done except keep her comfortable and wait for the inevitable. The family gathered, filling the house once more. Sarah held court from her bed, saying goodbye to each child and grandchild individually, imparting wisdom and love in equal measure. But mostly, she wanted Xavier. He sat beside her bed day and night, holding her hand, telling her stories of their life together, reminding her of their love. "I am not ready," Xavier said on the 3rd day when it was clear the end was near. "I am not ready to lose you, Sarah. I do not know how to exist in a world where you are not beside me." Sarah squeezed his hand with what little strength she had left. "You will be all right," she said, her voice thin but certain. "You are stronger than you think, and I will not really be gone. I will be in every sunrise over the mountains, every whistle of wind through the barn, every time you look at our children and grandchildren. I will be there." "It is not enough," Xavier said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I need you here with me where I can touch you and hear your voice and see your smile." "I know," Sarah said. "But Xavier, what a life we have had. What an adventure. I would not change a single moment, not even the hard times, because they all led us to this. To a life well lived, to love that lasted, to a legacy that will continue. Be grateful for that." "I am. I am grateful," Xavier managed. "I have been grateful every single day since you walked into my barn. You were the best thing that ever happened to me." "And you to me," Sarah said. She was fading now, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for asking me to stay. Thank you for filling my days with so much love. Thank you for being exactly who you are." "Sarah," Xavier said, but she had closed her eyes. Her breathing grew shallower, slower, and then, surrounded by family but holding Xavier's hand, Sarah Brennan took her last breath. The grief was crushing. Xavier felt like half of himself had been ripped away, leaving nothing but raw wound behind. He moved through the funeral in a daze, accepting condolences he barely heard, performing rituals that meant nothing because Sarah was not there to share them. They buried her on the hill next to Xavier's parents, overlooking the ranch they had built together. The whole territory seemed to turn out for the funeral, testament to the lives they had touched. But Xavier saw none of it, felt none of it. He was numb, going through motions, existing but not living. The days after were the hardest. Xavier would wake in the morning and reach for Sarah before remembering she was gone. He would see something funny and turn to share it with her before reality crashed back. The house felt empty even when filled with concerned family members. Food had no taste. Sleep brought no rest. Samuel tried to convince him to come live with them, but Xavier refused. "This is my home," he said stubbornly. "Our home. I am not leaving it." So his children and grandchildren took turns staying with him, making sure he ate and slept and did not simply give up. Slowly, painfully, Xavier began to find his way back to something resembling life. He would never be whole again, not without Sarah, but he could function. He could wake up and tend the animals and work the land. He could sit with his grandchildren and tell them stories about their grandmother. He could exist. One afternoon, about 6 months after Sarah's death, Xavier was working in the barn when he heard it, someone whistling an old Irish tune. His heart stopped, then started again with painful force. For just a moment, he thought impossibly that it was Sarah, that she had somehow come back. But when he turned, he saw it was Emma's daughter, little Sarah, named after her grandmother. She was sitting on a bale of hay petting Daisy's granddaughter, whistling the same song her grandmother had whistled in this very barn 50 years ago. "Where did you learn that song?" Xavier asked, his voice rough with emotion. Little Sarah looked up, her honey-colored eyes so like her grandmother's that it made Xavier's chest ache. "Grandma taught it to me before she got sick," the girl said. "She said it was special, that it was the song that brought you together. She made me promise to remember it and pass it on to my children someday." Xavier had to sit down, overwhelmed by love and loss and gratitude all tangled together. "She was right," he said when he could speak again. "It was the first thing I ever heard from her, this song. She was sitting right there, whistling just like you are now, and I fell in love with her before I even saw her face." "Tell me the story," little Sarah asked. "The whole thing from the beginning." So Xavier told her. He told her about finding a woman in his barn, about asking her to stay, about building a life together. He told her about the good times and the hard times, about love that lasted through everything. And as he talked, he felt something shift in his chest, a small easing of the constant ache. Sarah had been right, as always. She was not really gone. She lived on in their children and grandchildren, in the stories he told, in the legacy of love they had created together. She lived on in this ranch, every board and nail holding memories of their life together. Xavier continued on for 3 more years after Sarah's death. They were good years in their way, filled with family and work, and the satisfaction of seeing his legacy flourish. Samuel ran the ranch now with the same care Xavier had, passing the knowledge on to his own sons. The land prospered, the family grew, and through it all, Sarah's presence lingered like perfume. When Xavier died at 76, it was peacefully in his sleep, in the bed he had shared with Sarah for so many years. His children found him in the morning, his weathered face relaxed and peaceful, looking younger in death than he had since Sarah passed. They buried him beside her on the hill, as he had requested. The headstone reads simply, "Xavier Brennan, beloved husband, father, and friend." Below it, Sarah's stone said the same, replacing husband with wife. Together in death as they had been in life. The ranch continued on, passed down through generations, each adding their own stories to the legacy Xavier and Sarah had started. The house was expanded and updated, but the original structure remained, carefully preserved. Family stories were told and retold, the tale of the lonely rancher and the woman whistling in his barn becoming legend. Young couples in love would visit the graves on the hill, asking for blessings on their own unions. The story was written down, preserved, passed on as an example of what love could be when two people truly committed to building something together. And sometimes, on quiet autumn evenings when the wind was just right, people swore they could hear it. The faint sound of an old Irish tune being whistled in the barn, as if Sarah herself was still there, still singing, still filling Xavier's days with love even after both of them had long since turned to dust. The legacy they built lasted far beyond their lifetimes, beyond even the lifetimes of their children and grandchildren. The ranch itself eventually passed out of family hands, sold to a conservation trust that preserved it as a historic site. But the story lived on, told and retold, inspiring generation after generation with its message of love and courage, and the power of taking a chance on something beautiful and unlikely. In the end, Xavier and Sarah Brennan's greatest legacy was not the land or the cattle or even their many descendants. It was the proof they left behind that love, real and true and lasting, was possible even in the hardest of circumstances. That two lonely people could find each other against all odds and build something that would echo through time. It was the reminder that sometimes the most important moments in our lives come when we least expect them. That courage can look like asking a stranger to stay. That home is not a place, but a person who makes you feel whole. Their story was one of the American West, of homesteading and ranching and building something from nothing. But more than that, it was a universal story, a human story, about the transformative power of love and the extraordinary things that can grow from the smallest seeds of possibility. All because a lonely rancher heard a woman whistling in his barn and had the courage to ask her to fill his days forever. All because she had the courage to say yes.